Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to this hybrid seminar of the Liberalism Study Program at the George Washington University. We are here today delighted to receive our colleague to discuss the challenge of ethnopopulism and authoritarianism rule in Europe. And we are receiving Milada Anna Vachudova, who will be discussing that issues. She is specialized in European politics, political change in post-communist Europe, the European Union, and the impact of international actors on domestic politics. She has been widely publishing on populism, and she's an associate professor of political science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And she is here in DC today with us in person for another conference we will be having tomorrow discussing the situation in Central and Eastern Europe called Between EU and Russia. So once again, welcome, Milada. Thank you for being here, and I give you the floor now.
All right. Thank you so much, Marlene. It's really a pleasure to be here. There is so much to talk about today. We have an incredible moment right now in international and European politics where everything has been challenged so dramatically, both the post-Cold War European security architecture and also contestation in domestic politics. And the way in which just today, for example, we have the historic vote in the German Bundestag to support heavy military weapons for Ukraine. And this kind of domestic contestation that's happening surrounding the kind of challenge that the war has presented to us is really fascinating. And I want to get to that part of my talk fairly quickly. But for right now, I will start by talking about this phenomenon of ethnopopulism and how it actually relates to the challenge of authoritarian rule within the EU. Many have been writing recently about this being a kind of, I think Luke and Wade called it potentially a rebirth of democracy, the Western liberal order. Others have talked about a kind of watershed moment. I prefer to think of this as really a wake-up call that can help us put to one, restructure the ways in which domestic contestation in at least some European states handles the kind of concentration of power, disinformation, scapegoating that ethnopopulist regimes have brought us in several countries. For this audience, I'm going to be pretty quick with the background. How do I move my slides forward? Help me out. Thank you so much. Oh, you're good. It's a brave new world. Can I just go here? Okay, great. All right. So I'll start with just really quickly talking about the varieties of populism. Everyone here knows about the sort of basic mechanism of populism. You know, this promise to defend the people against the establishment, and crucially arguing that establishment elites are not governing in your interests, but only protecting their own privileges. But amongst that is a very, very broad family, as we all know, and also a tool that is as old as politics. But the varieties of populism tell us a lot about how populists potentially will also govern if they are elected. And populism on the economic left, here you have essentially the question of who are the people and who are the enemy. So the people are all those who suffer because of austerity, neoliberal economic policies, income inequality, and the enemy tend to be financial institutions, the super rich, political elites. But what is really critical about populism on the left, at least so far, at least in Europe, is that it has tended to take an inclusive view of who are the people. So it tends to be everyone who is in some ways economically disadvantaged, the 90%, the 95%, the 85%. And it is not about singling out as the other minorities, refugees, migrants. Kasmuda and his co-authors have written about this, an inclusionary versus an inclusionary view of the people. Ethnopopulism, or populism on the cultural right, is very different because the people are cast as part of an ethnicity, a culture, a nation, or even a religion that is under threat. And Professor Erin Jenny at the CEU has written extensively about this. And it creates, a kind of us, we're going to protect you against them, often layered upon some of the same arguments that left-wing economic populists make, but it's profoundly majoritarian, anti-populist, and of course illiberal, and really making that majoritarian argument that the rights of ethnic minorities should be trumped for the benefit of the people, the deserving people, and transmogrifying these calls for economic equality. Now, there's a very rich debate in the comparative politics literature about this, with very many amazing scholars writing about this. In my recent article on ethnopopulism, I tried to put all those scholars into the bibliography and really honor a lot of this incredible rich work that's been done. So I encourage you to look at all of that. The enemy that's really important here are domestic and transnational actors that are cast as culturally harmful outsiders. And they can either be ethnic minorities or LGBTQ, or they can be, they're cast on this transnational stage, which includes cosmopolitan elites of always George Soros and European institutions. Here are just a couple quick slides from the Chapel Hill Expert Survey that I work on, which help us kind of understand what is an ethnopopulist party. So here you have on the bottom the salience of anti-establishment rhetoric. So you would expect that all populist parties would score with a high salience for anti-establishment rhetoric, whether they're on the left, the right, or even some kind of a center. And then on the vertical axis, we see the salience of immigration rhetoric. And of course here, Fidesz in Hungary and the Law and Justice Party in Poland really pop out in terms of their placement on these axes. Austria and Italy give you another sense, right? The Brothers of Italy and Lega on the one hand, and the FPO in Austria, sorry. So why ethnopopulism? This has been an argument, kind of debate that's been happening over the last few months. And there are a few reasons I think that ethnopopulism is a better way to think about these parties than to just call them right-wing populist parties or radical populist parties. First of all, ethnopopulism captures the fact that this is a strategy not just to appeal to voters, to get support, to rally during the campaign, but ethnopopulism is also a strategy for justifying the concentration of power after you win office. And we've seen that really dramatically in Poland and Hungary, of course, but we've seen it also in other places, for example, Italy and Austria, where ethnopopulist parties have recently been in government, that using this majoritarian argument that the people are under threat from the kind of existential, civilizational, racial, transnational threat can then be used to justify taking steps to concentrate power, restrict the media, take all kinds of different steps that then reduce pluralism in the country, but also start tipping more and more the playing field. It's truly different from ethnic nationalism, and here again I refer to work of Professor Erin Jenny. The enemy is not neighboring nations, it's not adjoining or intermingled nations. It's this broad cultural and civilizational threat that's really strategically curated, and it's just incredibly flexible how they're able to kind of craft who are the people and who are the enemies of the people and who are the friends of the people, according to the kind of what's useful and what works in the moment. So some people have been arguing about a kind of deeply principled position that Law and Justice Party and the Fidesz have taken on this kind of defense of traditional Western values. But if you actually look at Orban's history in particular, he's tried out all different kinds of ways to portray who are the enemies of the people, and kind of goes with the ones, at least in my view, that have stuck. And it's also fascinating how, for example, Orban has been able to transform Vladimir Putin, at least until recently, into a friend of the Hungarian people in the way he presents the world. So it's really different from ethnic nationalism, and why this matters is that it has helped Orban and others create this kind of common cause across Europe and claim that they're uniting to defend the interests of the true and deserving Western Christian Europeans, something which would have been impossible under the old ethnic national scaffolding framework, because they're the main enemies of the people were usually, or the nation were usually adjoining neighboring nations. A couple other reasons why not to use right-wing populism. So I've already talked about the flexibility. Ethnopopulism captures that flexibility, but also the economic policies of these parties are increasingly on the left. So we can see that, for example, in these chapters with survey charts. Here you have the Polish parliamentary parties, and you can see Law and Justice Party has really never been considered a right-wing party when it comes to that kind of left-right economic understanding of that axis. And Hungary as well, right? And Hungary is really interesting, and I'm happy to share these slides, and there are different places that you can access them. Hungary is really interesting because here you really see a party system that has for decades now really functioned in terms of cultural contestation to poles, and not at all in terms of left-right economic competition. And this actually goes back from when we first started collecting data in 2001 for the Chapel Expert Survey, but Zsolt and Yeti and others who study Hungarian party politics will tell you that kind of contestation in terms of culture identity has been there since the birth of the current party system in 1989-90. So before I move on, just some takeaways from the rise of ethnopopulists and left-wing populists in the European party systems and what it's really meant for competition in different parts of Europe. You know, the greatest change has been in the substance of party competition, where powerful ethnopopulist parties have managed to kind of remake party systems. But it's the substance that really matters. So you have left-wing or center populist parties that have really kind of made a splash on the party scene. So think about Macron in France, for example, kind of blowing up the French party system. We think of him as more a centrist populist. Or you can look at Italy, where the Five-Star Movement is a sort of hybrid or centrist populist, or in Syriza left populist. So a lot of movement in the party system. But in the places where ethnopopulists have governed, you know, here we have the most consequential changes in terms of the substance of domestic politics. Like, where are these countries going? And of course, the most important ones are authoritarian rule in Hungary, and in the United Kingdom, I consider the British Conservative Party under Boris Johnson certainly an ethnopopulist party. And what's fascinating, right, is that Fidesz, the Tories in the UK, the Republicans in the United States, these are parties that have just been remodeled, refashioned from the inside using these ethnopopulist tools and arguments and appeals. You also see greater polarization, as I just talked about, you know, the kind of Hungarian model of a party system that really competes only on the cultural axis. This is something that we wonder whether that's kind of the future. We see some party systems moving closer and closer to that kind of contestation, whereas others are sort of preserving contestation on both economic left, right, and cultural axis. So what happens when populists rule? We don't have a lot of data, right? There haven't been a lot of really left-wing populist parties in government. There's been Syriza in Greece and Podemos in Spain. But so far, generally speaking, left populists seem to moderate when they're in power, and ethnopopulist parties seem to not moderate when they're in power. So they're not tempered by being in government. In fact, they use being in government to kind of dig in and amplify both their appeals, their kind of ethnopopulist us versus them appeals, and also their majoritarian arguments for destroying or dismantling liberal democratic institutions. And the one thing that really is troubling from the perspective of the EU, moving now more to the EU, is that Orban in particular in Hungary has tried to kind of lead a coalition to decouple the European Union from the regime type of liberal democracy. Why should the European Union be regime specific, right? Why he essentially would like to see the European Union a collection of countries where every country has whatever political system it wants, and he's right there hopefully helping guide other ethnopopulist parties to win power and then concentrate power in the kind of model that he has presented. And he's actually an active kind of helper. He goes on, he takes the show on the road. It backfired sometimes, in the Czech Republic when he came to campaign for Babiš before the fall elections. It certainly backfired in Slovenia, Janša. But generally, he's been there as a kind of emissary of this kind of two-step ethnopopulist rule: appeal to the voters, get in power, and then use ethnopopulism to justify concentration of power. So one of the things which we've all noticed, I think, but it's sort of been fun to put it on the slide and write about it, is like the incredible resilience that some of these regimes have to basically hypocrisy. I mean, it's like they have not 9 lives, but 22 lives. You think of Boris Johnson in the UK, like, and nothing seems to stick to that guy. But there's also some real hypocrisy, right, in terms of how they govern and in terms of policy making. So we see, for example, with neoliberal economic reforms, they might come in saying, we're going to change these, we're going to roll these back, but very often they don't. Partial exception might be the Law and Justice Party in Poland, which has actually tackled poverty and child poverty in particular. Also incredibly hypocritical on climate change. Also in terms of these methods, right, they say, especially Poland and Hungary, the ruling ethnopopulists say that their mission is to finally remove the communists from power in these countries, that really 89 was a false transition. But they then now are using many of the same methods that the Communist Party used to concentrate power, to end free discourse in the country. A lot of anti-pluralist moves, not just in the media, but also in trying to control culture, education. And how far this has gone, especially in Hungary, is, I think, truly, truly shocking and terrible. And obviously sought support from the Kremlin. One of my real pet peeves is this conflation of liberal democracy and neoliberal economic policies. And here I think scholars and journalists and pundits and think tankers have also gone down this road of kind of writing about how Eastern Europe has rejected liberalism, how East Central European countries have turned away from liberalism without really specifying what that means. And that plays into the hands of the Law and Justice Party in Poland, Orban, but also others like Salvini, who make the argument that we need to, you don't like the outcome of these neoliberal economic policies. In order to roll them back, we need to walk away from liberalism. And they conflate changing those economic policies with destroying or dismantling, diminishing liberal democracy as a political system, right? With pluralism, with protection for civic rights, civil society, ethnic minority rights, and so forth. So I think it's good to be more specific. Okay, so what about responses to Russia's war against Ukraine? So I have about 10 minutes left, and I want to just talk about some really recent things, and there'll be lots of question marks because, of course, we don't know the answers. But so far, I think we can certainly detect there's kind of 2 main types of responses on the part of ethnopopulist parties and ruling ethnopopulist parties in particular. One is very strong support for Ukraine, and this for Poland and for the United Kingdom. So for the Law and Justice Party in Poland and for Boris Johnson personally and his government in the UK has been a way to sort of remake their image as statesmen on the European scene, leaders in Europe, as opposed to countries that have been seen as undermining and diminishing the power of liberal democracy and values in Europe and undermining the European Union. Now, the help that Poland and the United Kingdom have given to Ukraine has been absolutely invaluable. So we can both sort of point out that they've been using this to revamp their image, and also be very clear that help that especially Poland and also the UK have given Ukraine has been absolutely the right thing to do and very, very important. Now, this kind of image we're making did not save, Janša in Slovenia, who, took the train to Kyiv and was hoping at the last minute to change his fortunes. I'm not an expert on Slovenia, but it certainly feels like the Slovenian people were saying a little bit like, no, not that track, not a friend of Orban. That's not what we want. Another is kind of digging in, and we see that with Orban in Hungary. And we were all, I think, many of us surprised at how, and it just goes to show the flexibility that Orban has in terms of his anti-populist appeals. He was able to use the war to his advantage. We were all hoping or wondering whether being seen as such a close ally of Putin, Hungary's increasing dependence on Russia economically would be a liability for him. And what he managed to argue was that, vote for me because if you vote for me, you have peace and stability. If you vote for the opposition, you're voting for war, you're voting for economic instability, unpredictability. That said, we really have to be very clear that elections in Hungary at this point are not free and fair elections. And so to say that it was Orban's, campaigning and the way he appealed to the voters, which led to the outcome, is false. Those elections now are not free and fair. And it's really a warning to what happens when these ethnopopulist regimes can stay in power for that long. The playing field is so tipped through media control, but in other ways, gerrymandering, that we lose that connection, right, between what Orban says and how he appeals to the voters is a little bit besides the point in terms of how the elections turn out. So some of the big questions, right? So a wake-up call for Europe. I have to pause here and say that we are at a moment where I feel quite a few scholars and commentators are thinking about ways in which Europe is going to be better off as a result of this war in terms of unity, in terms of some of the things I'm about to talk about. But this comes at a tremendous cost, which has been borne by Ukraine, civilians, military, towns being destroyed, very, very extensive civilian casualties, incredibly cruel suffering. And so we kind of need to always bear that in mind when we think about some of the potentially positive consequences of this war in terms of uniting Europe. So one of them, of course, is hopefully, and perhaps we see some evidence already exposing some of the hypocrisy of ethnopopulist parties, and also their close connections with the Kremlin and with Putin. The Czech Republic already sent off its ethnopopulist government in the fall. Slovenia did last weekend. Are the prospects for a kind of authoritarian bloc in the EU dimming? And this will depend also on the enlargement, which I'll talk about next. So two things, I think, the critical domestic debates in EU states, which are being debated, on the one hand, the well-being of the voters, economic stability, let's keep that Russian gas flowing, unfortunately kind of packaged in the knowledge that many West European elites, for example, in Germany, have had very close economic ties with the Kremlin, have benefited from that. Versus, on the other hand, military aid and tough sanctions, which incur domestic political costs at home. The United States has always been better than European countries, I think we can say, in having a foreign policy that incurs domestic costs for the population. This is exactly what's being worked out right now. But of course, today we have this very historic vote in the Bundestag, where the Germans, I think, a very large majority have voted to send heavy weapons to Ukraine. We've talked a lot about turning points in Germany since the war began on February 24th, but I think this vote in the Bundestag might be really the true turn. Now we've had a lot prevarication, and what some commentators have dubbed schultzing around. And it has been really a very a moment where you felt like Germany's position as a leader, a liberal democratic leader, was really under threat. You have the curious case of Bulgaria, which Putin, as the master strategist, here is one of the countries that was sitting on the fence, right? That had a domestic discussion where there was strong voices on both sides. My colleague Maria Popova is an expert on this, so if you want to learn more, go to her Twitter feed. And but truly was sitting on the fence, and then Putin cuts off gas to Bulgaria, and I think within the next 5 minutes, Bulgaria decides to send heavy weapons to Ukraine. So that was a case of a kind of we see this often in this war now, where you feel like where Putin makes decisions that seem to be against what his master plan ought to be, and Putin seems to be overplaying his hand in a number of ways. So we may see that Bulgaria is actually what happens also in places like Switzerland and Austria, where eventually, because of what's happening in the war, these domestic debates will tip decisively towards helping with heavy weapons and tough sanctions and incurring those domestic costs for that foreign policy. But I'm an optimist, and that's what I hope is going to continue to happen. And the other thing is there's a really critical challenge for the EU to resuscitate the EU enlargement process. This is an opportunity to take what had been in the past the EU's most powerful foreign policy instrument. It was able in the 2000s to really say, like, here we used our leverage, the power of the EU, the normative and civil power of the EU to help promote democratization, to enlarge the area of peace and stability in Europe, to bring these countries in. And then it sort of has fallen apart. And that meritocratic aspect of the enlargement process has been completely lost. At this point, there's no relationship anymore. For example, North Macedonia, and whether it implements reforms and moves forward in the EU enlargement process. So it's moribund, and beyond that, it's actually embarrassing. It's shameful that the EU has, for a whole host of different reasons, managed to lose this process as a kind of meritocratic, technocratic process enveloped in political will that I think has been incredibly successful. We can argue about, could it have been done differently? Could we have avoided Hungary? We could have avoided Hungary, but some of that has to do with how the European People's Party protected Hungary after Orban was elected in 2010. It doesn't just go back to the substance of the enlargement process. So this is a very big topic. But Ukraine, I think, challenges now the EU to resuscitate this enlargement process, to bring back a meritocratic pre-accession process. Of course, it's never going to be a perfect meritocracy, but it can't be the case that countries are blocked because a neighboring country has some beef with that country. It can't be this kind of capricious process because countries won't participate in that kind of process and won't continue to reform. Ukraine itself, and here I send you to Oksana Chevelle and Maria Popova's recent work. There's hope that Ukraine can actually be the kind of candidate that works extremely hard and gets the institutional reforms on the ground. It's already demonstrated really dramatic state capacity at the local, regional, and national level. A lot of adopting and implementing the acquis communautaire is about state capacity. Ukraine seems to have that. Let's see, it's early. On the other hand, political will. And, we again can't look into the future, but on what we see today in Ukraine, the political will to accomplish this appears to be tremendous. So I'll end on this slide and just say, some of the questions that I'm thinking about are the tables turning against ethnopopulists, changing the EU dramatically from within. And by this, I mean this coalition of countries that Orban was building. He was the leader, of course, other ethnopopulist far-right leaders would have been happy to be the leader too. But the idea was that you have more and more countries with a similar illiberal or authoritarian rule as in Hungary, and this essentially changes the EU fundamentally from the inside. Whether or not this prospect is dimmed is going to, of course, depend largely on domestic politics in these countries. How is domestic contestation going to go forward? Who's going to win the next Polish elections? But we also have the EU rule of law mechanism that is now going to be kicked in again against Hungary, and those things will matter. The EU has a decision to make whether it's going to fight for it being an international institution of liberal democracies. This is something it's sort of taken for granted, didn't really fight for. Berlusconi, well, that wasn't a big problem. There was a lot of variation in regime type within the EU, but it wasn't of this kind of scale, and it wasn't the kind that tried to take over the EU. So the EU at the moment needs to fight for that. And then also the importance of civic mobilization and protest movements across these countries. We see, I am so often asked whether democratic backsliding is something that's happening in Eastern Europe and not Western Europe. So it's about post-communism, it's about weak institutions. Well, yes and no, right? On the one hand, yes, where we've seen the most democratic backsliding has been in Poland and Hungary, of course, the Czech Republic until recently, other cases of post-communist, not so much backsliding, but also being kind of stuck in a cycle of corruption and poor governance. On the other hand, the kind of parties that have concentrated power, these ethnopopulist parties, you have extremely similar parties doing very well sometimes in West European countries, in Italy and Austria. And of course, in the UK, Brexit is an incredible consequence, I would argue, of ethnopopulist rule. But at the same time, you see in Eastern Europe a great amount of mobilization, these tremendous protest movements, and in the Czech Republic, for example, the voting out of Babiš in the fall is directly tied, I think, to a nationwide sort of civic mobilization on a scale that hadn't happened since 1989. And so in terms of the quality of democracy, while we talk about backsliding and weak institutions, we also need to talk about mobilization and civic participation and see that there's really very strong contestation in these countries, which is what democracy is ultimately all about. All right, I will end there and happily take some questions.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Milada. I propose you stay here near the screen so people can see you here. Our audience who is online can see you, and I will be managing the Q&A from the map. So I invite people who are in the audience to ask questions, and I will be moderating the discussion. And we also have a possibility, of course, to have questions in the room. If you have any, you're welcome. Milada, I see one first question on going back to the relationship to Russia. Do you think it's possible that there would just be a decoupling of being pro-Russian and being ethnopopulist, and that we could just imagine that you can remain ethnopopulist and no more having the kind of link to Russia, and the fact that it's now Orban, in a sense, has become the main kind of leader of a coalition of European ethnopopulists and no more Putin. So you could imagine something that would be more Orban-centered and Putin being marginalized, and that would allow ethnopopulists to kind of put on the side their relationship to Russia, not to cancel it entirely, but just to make it much more discreet. So if you could redevelop that potential decoupling.
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like, Poland has been trying to do this. The Law and Justice Party in Poland has tried to do both, really textbook ethnopopulism at home with, a very vicious kind of rhetoric of us versus them, and standing up for these traditional Western Christian values. So in a way, sounding a lot like Putin and certainly like Orban, and yet at the same time claiming to be intensely anti-Putin. So Law and Justice have been doing this for a long time, but at the same time, very close to Orban. And so it's always been difficult to, for Polish observers to sort of comment on this anti-Russianness and yet actually doing what Putin would want within the European Union, helping to divide it and dismantle it and weaken it. And so I feel like going forward, it's going to be a little bit harder. One question I have is whether all of this will change in any way the Law and Justice Party, whether the Law and Justice Party is seeing, how pro-EU actually the polls are, including their own voters. And this might be a moment of stepping back a little bit from some of those most damaging policies, damaging from my point of view. For the others, I think that's absolutely right, that there will be a moving away from the Kremlin, from Putin, from that support. But I think the problem might be Viktor Orban, in the sense that if the European Union is serious, and we have a long road to travel before there are real sanctions on Hungary from the point of view of withdrawing EU funds. But Orban is set to turn to Russia, to China, in order to keep his economy going and all the money he needs to give away to his inner circle and to the middle class in Hungary. I think it will be actually hard for him to distance himself from Russia. He's going to continue to use Russian energy. The question is whether that is actually a way in which these leaders can be discredited at home, whether that kind of being close to Putin. And if you look at debates today in Austria and Italy, it doesn't give you a lot of hope. There's still very loud voices saying, let's just be nice to Putin so that we can get our energy and have a quiet life.
Thank you. We have another question about migration. Many of these ethnopopulist claims depend on a real or imagined migrant threat. So how do you think that if migration continue in the future, how that can be? I mean, if Ukrainian migration, like refugees flows from Ukraine, are kind of there in Europe for long, do you think there is a moment where there could be a kind of fatigue of the receiving societies toward Ukrainian, or the fact that they are not, we also have the debates about, it's easier to be a refugee if you are white and Christian than if you are a refugee from the Middle East. And then we can have also more kind of climate change related refugees coming also from Southern Mediterranean. So how do you see this kind of articulation of different type of refugees producing different type of narrative in Europe evolving?
So my sincere hope is that this is a short war. My hope is it ends tomorrow, but it's a relatively short war. And so the refugees, the Ukrainian refugees who are in the EU now, are almost entirely women and children. And that means that for them to stay, there either has to be family unification, meaning things are so bad in Ukraine that the men come and join their families and settle permanently. Or these anyway. So there's probably a temporary, or we all hope that there's a temporary nature to the Ukrainian refugees, to the 5 million Ukrainian refugees in the EU. But interestingly, I wonder whether it will not be in the interest of some of those receiving countries to actually keep their Ukrainian refugees, right? The EU countries have a demographic crisis. They need immigrants. And so I do predict that there's going to be a kind of tension between families, very much like Ukraine very much is going to want all these people to come home. And some of the hosting countries are actually going to have an interest in keeping them. Now, is there a racial element to that? I think absolutely there is. It's easier to politically in any of these countries to take Ukrainian refugees as opposed to refugees from the Middle East. It's a difficult topic right now when we have 5 million refugees in Ukraine and the war is raging, to talk about those racial aspects of it, because I think we have to honor the fact that these refugees are being welcomed and treated, and I think really well. And remember that when the Syrian refugees and others came in 2015, there were many Europeans who were opening their homes or helping back then as well. It just got really viciously politicized in many countries. So hopefully what we can do going forward is say, look at how well Europe responded to this refugee wave from Ukraine. Next time we have a refugee wave, no matter where it's from, let's see if we can't respond like that, even though there will be very, differences between the kind of people coming.
Thanks. And if I may add, I think also the gender aspect of the refugee crisis is playing a role, right? The fact that it's mostly female refugees crisis, it's helped probably symbolically for the kind of more welcoming aspect. We have another question on the relationship or the balance or disbalance between ethnopopulist movement and classic right. And the fact that so even if some ethnopopulist movement in Europe seems to be like slowing down or stagnating, we still have issues with several countries not having any more a kind of classic radical right? We have so the case of the UK, as you said, being kind of now captured by the populists. We have the same here with the Republican Party. In France, the Républicains were at 5% in the vote. I mean, Germany is slightly different, of course, with the Christian Democrats, but isn't that the key question is maybe how the non-populist right has to reinvent itself in order to avoid being captured by the populist movement, and it seems this classic right seems to be going not so well in Europe. So if you could comment on that kind of question.
That is a great question, and I think this is what we were all celebrating Emmanuel Macron and La République en Marche, exclamation point, right? Because this was, if you kind of see the argument that, well, you need more emotion in politics, you need a kind of populist from the center to push away the populists from the right or the ethnopopulist parties. And Emmanuel Macron seemed to be the answer, right? Populist a bit, but centrist, pro-European. And well, what did we see in this election campaign? We saw that party moving to the right. I mean, I think really, for me, I think the revealing moment was when I think Macron's education minister argued that the biggest enemy of France right now were Western American universities with their gender neutral pronouns coming to France to destroy French civilization. So it's a twist on a kind of ethnopopulist argument. So what does that tell us? That it's hard to appeal to voters now without that populist aspect, that all the reconstitution of sort of strong center-right parties is going to be a real challenge. I don't have the answers, but I'm pretty sure that more emotion in politics and more of this kind of populism is going to be part of it. As someone put it to me recently, one of my students, is Emmanuel Macron sort of the best that we can hope for?
Thanks. A question from the room now.
Hello, I'm Stephen Livingston, a GW professor with a number of appointments all over the place. Also, I'm in Europe at the University of Helsinki. What a terrific talk. I really found this a rich presentation, and I'm walking away thinking we need to meet over coffee or something, because there's so many things I want to ask you. But one of the things I want to say is, it's a follow-up to this last question. The problem with what is called the classical right in the United States, and in some instances in Europe, especially in the UK, is that they were the neoliberal party. The Reagan Republicans were the ones that wanted globalization, deregulation, etc., that has given rise to the very economic conditions, I would argue, that feeds populism. I love your distinction between ethnopopulism and not calling it right-wing populism. I think that's really helpful, because what that is telling us is the part of the appeal of the ethnocentric right is to fill in the gap in basic income, basic decent ways of making a living and educating your children, etc. So they're feeding into the vacuum that was created by the very neoliberal policies that the quote unquote classical right introduced beginning as early as the 70s and certainly the 80s with Reagan and Thatcher. So isn't that a part of the problem? This is that the Tories in the UK, the Republicans here, where do they go? They have to make that decision. I would love to hear what you have to say about that.
And that is a great question. And so we talk about the fact that it's actually not just the center right, but also the collapse of the support for the left. Because you see in its best instantiation, the most successful, for example, let's say the Law and Justice Party in Poland, they capture both sets of issues, right? They deeply capture, as you say, this argument that we need to roll back neoliberal economic policies and guarantee. They've been especially successful with funding for, payments for children. Each family gets a payment. And at the same time, they also pick up the anti-immigration and pro-Western Christian values arguments. So in that sense, their package is very powerful. What's interesting about Boris Johnson in the UK is that he made many of these arguments when he was campaigning. And so did Donald Trump here in the US. We need to help the ordinary man who's been left behind in small town America, who's lost not just in terms of their job security, but also their status. But what's interesting is that in power, Boris Johnson's government does not actually do very much, and as Donald Trump's didn't either, right? So it's saying one thing and then in power doing this very continuing the same policies. So continuing the same policies, but being able to say that, well, the left, even if you elect the left, those are their policies too, right? And that I think is a really difficult position for these parties to be in. The thing about I can't speak so much to the US, but in the UK, what we see is that the media environment makes it actually very difficult for the hypocritical nature of this to really sink in with some voters, because they don't get that information, that Boris Johnson campaigned on this, but his actual policies are the opposite, continuing with deregulation and all of that. The media environments become so segmented, and so it's very hard to point out, as I mentioned, this hypocrisy. I think what is going to happen though is that more and more parties, and we see that in other party systems, are moving towards this combination of basically left-wing social democratic economic policies with ethnopopulist arguments. Where I'm hopeful though is that these ethnopopulist parties often overplay their hand. And so if you look at Salvini in Italy, or you look at the FPÖ in Austria, they're not actually good at governing or disciplining themselves. And so we have, even the law and justice parties have made some serious mistakes along the way that I think should have led to their defeat last time. It was close. So if anything, I would say we can see this powerful playbook that they could combine and really push away both center left and center right. But in practice, when they try to govern, they're much less effective.
If I can add, Marine Le Pen is another good example, right, of combining like right on the cultural side and left on the economic side. And if she would be continuing without the economic left aspect, she wouldn't be at 41%. She would be at 50% like her father, right? So what allowed the jump is the shift toward a welfare state narrative.
And a lot of scholars sort of blame the left because they say the left-wing social democratic parties failed to represent their voters. And I think there's a good argument to be made there that this is kind of where left-wing parties dropped the ball, that they weren't sort of right there always communicating to their voters that their number one issue is bread and butter, taking care of the working class.
Another question on do you think that there is an issue in the literature between dissociated ethnopopulism for the kind of genuine revival of conservative values and of kind of religion being an important element in the kind of public space? And of course, when we think about Poland, we see them kind of naturally overlapping, but is there a way where we should be more careful in kind of dissociating them? And I'm thinking with the French case, the revival of kind of political Catholicism, right? That is happening on the public space. It's happening outside of the National Front aspect, right? So it's happening in other, they can be connected, of course, but you have a kind of, seems to have a genuine revival of people who wants to express some conservative values, either in terms of making their like religiosity or cultural religiosity public, or having a kind of more kind of traditional value, traditional family argument. So should we try to dissociate that better and not necessarily consider that as being connected automatically to populism?
That's a great question. And my colleague Anna Jamal Hussein has written about this, and others, I think Peter Hall also, we can't push away the need for community, right? And that voters are both saying, you know, we want economic security, we want economic status, but we also want belonging and a sense of community. And how can you find that community while preserving pluralism and preserving the separation of church and state? And I feel like this is an area where, you know, I know that, for example, in Poland, what the Law and Justice Party has done in the short term has been very powerful in that it has made a kind of pact with the leadership of the Catholic Church, which is an extreme leadership, right? The Catholic Church has people from all corners and nooks and crannies of the political spectrum. But I think it's fair to say the Polish Catholic Church is like really extreme. They're far more extreme than the Pope. Let's put it that way. The Pope is considered an unwanted liberal influence. But the problem is, okay, that works now is kind of a power to amplify the power of both parties. But what I hear, and perhaps I'm hearing only what I want to hear in terms of being kind of optimistic, is that it's turning a lot of young people away from the Catholic Church because they just see it as a political instrument. And so they're pushing away those traditions and seeing the church not as a place to be, you know, an individual spiritual in a community, but it's just another political weapon. And so that is a warning, I think, and we'll know more, you know, in 10 or 20 years, for others to sort of fight for the kind of religiosity that is separate from the state and that respects a pluralistic, you know, and multicultural polity. But I think that's a great question, and I think that's one of those questions we all are, you know, want to have the answer to, but don't.
And maybe a last question on the impact of the pandemics on ethnopopulism. Do we consider that it has been, in a sense, increasing or the legitimacy of ethnopopulist narrative, because it was very much about protection of the kind of collective body, closing borders, like deglobalizing, or do we consider that, on the contrary, the capacity of the European state to kind of respond to the pandemics and the more kind of inclusive and discussing public health issues are, in a sense, kind of push the balance back to more kind of mainstream party and delegitimize the ethnopopulist one?
So we do have some preliminary kind of outcomes where we can say that governments that went the road of conspiracy theories and so forth tended to have worse outcomes on the ground than governments that turned to science and expertise. One of the really damaging thing about populism, especially on, you know, ethnopopulist parties on the cultural right, has been this rejection of experts, right? Oh, experts are just a part of this canvas of transnational liberal elites who are trying to undermine your well-being in one way or the other to benefit themselves. And so that was a terrible way to start the pandemic, as we all know, especially here in the United States. And I feel fairly optimistic that the course of the pandemic has muted those voices and has sort of foregrounded scientific voices and sort of governance that reflects science and expertise. So in that sense, and there's some good data coming out in terms of public opinion polls across the EU that people have turned more towards science and expertise in terms of how they feel their countries should be governed. So that's good. And I, you know, also the European Union. So generally speaking, the European Union, the trust in the European Union has gone up, I think, as a result of the pandemic. So generally speaking, I think those initial ones where we're thinking this is all about closing borders and so forth, has not panned out. Although, you know, some of the most authoritarian or ethnopopulist leaders had their moments where they were able to harness that to get their countries to do things in terms of COVID.
And maybe we still have like 2-3 minutes.
Yeah.
A following question on the pandemics or the management of the pandemics in Hungary. It's one of the worst, right, in terms of deaths, and still Orban was able to kind of manage that pretty well. So how do you think the pandemics how did he succeed in not having the pandemics becoming a kind of element playing against him?
Mm-hmm. I think this just goes back to Hungary not being a democratic polity anymore, right? I mean, here in the US, we struggle to understand how, you know, basic facts can penetrate the information environment in which we live. But in Hungary, we really have now complete control of most media by the Orban government and the spectacular use of the state administration to campaign for Orban essentially every single day. And if you layer that on top of, you know, the opposition not having any access to media, and on top of gerrymandering, and on top of all of the ways in which many institutions in Hungary, whether economic ones or businesses or in the arts, are now in some ways enmeshed in this mafia state that Orban has built, it kind of shows that he can kind of get away with everything until he doesn't one day. Right? I mean, we all remember 1989. I mean, hopefully until one day he doesn't. And I think the real question is moving forward whether the European Union will become a real actor, both in terms of helping Ukraine move, not just overcome the war, but join the European Union, which I really believe would be in the very best interest of the EU itself for a whole host of, not just political, but also economic reasons. And also to kind of draw a line. You know, it will be costly to sanction Hungary to take those kinds of steps against a member state. But at some point, if the EU is going to preserve even its geopolitical power as a regrouping of countries that are liberal democracies that have this normative power that stems from that, it's going to have to start fighting. And you know, the politicians who haven't wanted to fight have especially been, right, in Germany, but also in Austria. And it feels like the way in which all of that is being jolted now by the war in Ukraine could have positive effects on this fight.
Well, on that optimistic note, I think that's a good one to have to conclude our event. I wanted to thank you, Milada, for being with us today. Thank you to the audience and to all our participants online. We invite you to reconnect with us tomorrow for a full day, and including Saturday morning, a full day of conferences discussing Central and Eastern Europe with several guest speakers, including Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, tomorrow at 11. So once again, thank you all of us for being with us, and hopefully we will continue our discussion on populism in following seminars. Thank you and bye-bye.